The meeting happened at Sullivan's John Deere dealership in Marshalltown, Iowa, on a Tuesday evening in February 1980. 18 farmers packed into the showroom, invited by dealer principal Rick Sullivan for what he called an important business opportunity you can't afford to miss. Rick stood beside a brand new John Deere 4440 forest green paint gleaming under the showroom lights, and delivered his pitch with the confidence of a man who genuinely believed what he was selling. "Gentlemen, we're at a turning point in agriculture. Corn prices are strong, $3 a bushel. Land values are climbing 15% a year. This is the time to modernize, to upgrade your equipment, to position yourself for the growth that's coming in the 1980s. He patted the 4440. "This machine represents the future. 90 horsepower, sound guard cab with air conditioning, power shift transmission. This isn't just a tractor, it's a business investment. And right now, John Deere Credit is offering special financing. 12% over 7 years. Your payment on this $45,000 machine would be just $670 a month." Rick looked around the room. "I know what you're thinking. Rick, I've got a Farmall that still runs. Why would I trade?" Here's why. That Farmall is costing you money every day. It's inefficient. It's unreliable. It breaks down. Most importantly, it's holding you back from maximizing your operation. He had prepared a chart showing productivity comparisons. A 1958 Farmall 560 can plow maybe 12 acres in a 10-hour day. This 4440 can do 22 acres in the same time. That's nearly double the productivity. Over a season, that's weeks of time saved. Time is money, gentlemen. 17 of the 18 farmers were nodding. This made sense. The economy was good. Borrowing was cheap. 12% seemed reasonable in 1980. Equipment was expensive, but so was everything else. The 18th farmer, a quiet man named Walter Brennan, sat in the back and said nothing. Rick continued. "We're offering top trade-in values this month only. Your old Farmalls, your old cases, your old equipment will give you premium prices. More than you'd get at auction. More than you'd get private sale. This is a limited-time opportunity." After the presentation, 16 farmers signed trade-in agreements that night, committed to new John Deere tractors, committed to monthly payments of $600 to $800 for 7 years. Walter Brennan walked out without signing anything. One farmer, Tom Henderson, caught up with Walter in the parking lot. "You're not trading your 560. Walter was 61 years old, had been farming since 1937, owned 400 acres free and clear. His 1958 Farmall 560 had 11,000 hours on it, still ran fine. "Nope. Rick's right, you know. These new tractors are twice as productive. You're leaving money on the table." "Maybe," Walter said, "but I'm not taking on debt at my age. That 560 is paid for. It works. I'll keep using it until it doesn't work anymore." Tom shook his head. "Walter, you're being penny-wise and pound-foolish. This is the time to leverage. Borrow cheap money, buy productive equipment, make more profit. That's how you build wealth in farming. Or that's how you go broke when things turn," Walter said quietly. "Things aren't going to turn. Look around. Economy's strong. Ag sector's booming. This is the new normal." Walter got in his truck. "Hope you're right, Tom. But I've been farming 43 years. Seen booms before. They always end. I'll stick with my Farmall." Over the next 3 months, spring of 1980, those 16 farmers took delivery of their new John Deere tractors. Tom Henderson got a 4440 for $45,200. Another farmer, Jim Wilson, got a bigger 4640 for $52,800. Others got 4240s, 4430s, various models. Total equipment financed by that group, $782,000. All 16 started making monthly payments. $600, $700, $800 per month, depending on the model. They planted their 1980 crops with their new equipment, impressed by the power, the comfort, the technology. Walter Brennan planted his crop with the same 1958 Farmall 560 he'd had for 22 years. The 1980 season was good. Corn hit $3, 10 per bushel. Farmers with new equipment felt vindicated. The productivity gains were real. Tom Henderson covered more acres faster, finished planting 3 days earlier than usual. Worth it, he thought, totally worth the payment. Then 1981 arrived, and everything changed. Interest rates spiked as the Federal Reserve fought inflation. The prime rate hit 21.5% by June. The grain embargo devastated exports. Corn prices fell from $3.10 to $2.80, then to $2.40, then to $2.10. Land values stopped climbing and started falling. The farmers who'd signed up for cheap 12% financing in 1980 discovered their loans had variable rates. As the prime rate climbed, their rates adjusted. 12% became 15%, then 18%. Tom Henderson's payment jumped from $670 per month to $840. Jim Wilson's went from $780 to $970. And their income was cut in half as corn prices collapsed. By 1982, the full crisis was underway. Of the 16 farmers who traded in their Farmalls in 1980, 14 were in serious financial trouble. They had land payments, equipment payments, operating loans, all at historically high interest rates, all while their gross income had been cut 50%. Tom Henderson went to Rick Sullivan's dealership in March 1982, tried to work something out. "Rick, I can't make these payments. The rate has jumped 6 points. My payment is $840 a month. At $2 corn, I can't afford that." Rick, who was facing his own crisis as equipment sales collapsed, could only say, "Talk to John Deere Credit. There's nothing I can do." John Deere Credit offered no flexibility. Miss 3 payments, and they'd repossess the tractor. Tom missed 2 payments, scrambled to catch up, missed 3 more. In October 1982, John Deere Credit sent a repo truck, took the 44 440 that Tom had owned for 2.5 years. Tom had paid $21,680 in payments over 32 months. The tractor sold at auction for $18,200. John Deere Credit applied that to Tom's remaining balance of $38,400. Tom still owed them $2,200 for a tractor he no longer had. His land was mortgaged. He had operating debt. The tractor repo triggered other creditors. By March 1983, Tom Henderson lost his entire operation. 480 acres farmed by his family since 1947 foreclosed. The same story repeated across those 16 farmers. By the end of 1985, 13 of them had lost their farms entirely. The equipment they'd bought in 1980 had destroyed them. 3 managed to survive by selling land, downsizing dramatically, declaring bankruptcy to discharge the equipment debt. They kept farming but were shells of what they'd been. Walter Brennan, who'd said no to Rick Sullivan's pitch in February 1980, just kept farming with his 1958 Farmall 560. His only debt was his land payment, and he'd paid most of that off over the decades. When corn hit $2.10, his income fell just like everyone else's, but he had no equipment payment. That $670, $840 per month difference, $8,000, $10,000 per year, was the difference between survival and failure. The 560 kept running. Walter maintained it carefully. When something broke, he fixed it. The engine needed rebuilding in 1984. Walter did it himself over a weekend, $380 in parts. The hydraulic pump failed in 1986. Rebuilt it, $140 in parts. Clutch wore out in 1988. Replaced it, $95 in parts. His total equipment maintenance costs from 1980-1990 averaged $420 per year. His neighbors had been paying $8,000, $10,000 per year in equipment payments. That difference, compounded over a decade, was hundreds of thousands of dollars. By 1990, Walter was one of only 4 farmers still operating from that original group of 18 who'd attended Rick Sullivan's meeting. The other 3 were the ones who'd survived by downsizing and bankruptcy. Rick Sullivan's dealership closed in 1985. He'd sold all that equipment on commission, made good money in 1980, then watched it all collapse. The business his father had started in 1948 was gone. Walter Brennan farmed until 1995, when he retired at age 76. Sold his 400 acres for $1,150 per acre, $580,000. Retired comfortably, debt-free, with substantial savings. In 2024, at age 105, Walter Brennan is still alive, living in a care home in Marshalltown. His 1958 Farmall 560, the tractor he refused to trade in 1980, still runs. His grandson farms with it occasionally. Of the 18 farmers who attended that meeting in February 1980, Walter is the only one still alive, and his family is the only one still farming. The 16 who took Rick Sullivan's advice lost everything. The 3 who survived are dead now. Only Walter remains. At a family gathering in 2023, Walter's great-grandson asked him, "Grandpa, why didn't you trade in the Farmall when everyone else did?" Walter, 104 years old, sharp as ever, said, "Because I'd seen it before. The 1920s boom, the Depression crash, the 1950s boom, the 1960s squeeze. Every time dealers tell you to borrow and expand. Every time the farmers who borrow lose everything when the inevitable crash comes. I just didn't forget the lesson. The JD dealers convinced everyone to trade their Farmalls in 1980. Only the one who said no still farms. That's the whole story. But the story of that February 1980 meeting and what happened next deserves much more detail, because those 18 farmers represented a microcosm of what happened across the entire Midwest, and Walter Brennan's decision to say no represented wisdom that almost nobody heeded. The meeting had been carefully orchestrated. Rick Sullivan didn't just invite random farmers, he invited successful farmers, opinion leaders, men who others watched and copied. If he could get them to upgrade, others would follow. That's how you create momentum in farm equipment sales. The showroom had been set up deliberately. New 4440 front and center under spotlights. Smaller 4240 to the left, bigger 4640 to the right. All green and yellow, all gleaming, all representing the promise of modern farming. Coffee and donuts at the back, folding chairs arranged in rows. Professional, Rick had prepared meticulously. He'd researched each farmer's current equipment, knew who had old Farmalls, old cases, old Internationals, knew who'd been farming with the same tractor for 15, 20 years. Those were his targets. His presentation lasted 45 minutes, started with market conditions, strong grain prices, rising land values, the boom economy, showed charts proving agricultural prosperity would continue. This wasn't speculation. This was data from USDA, from industry analysts, from economic forecasters. The 1980s were going to be even better than the 1970s. Then equipment comparisons, old versus new, showed how much slower, how much less efficient the old tractors were. Gentlemen, you're competing with farmers who have modern equipment. Every hour you spend in the field, they're covering twice as much ground. Over a season, that's weeks of difference. You can't compete long-term with 20-year-old tractors. Then the financing pitch. This was Rick's specialty, made debt sound like wealth building. 12% might sound high compared to 5 years ago, but look at your return. This tractor will increase your productivity 30%. 30%. Your gross income goes up by thousands, and your payment is just $670 a month. You're netting money from day one. The math seemed sound. Most of these farmers were grossing $80,000, $120,000 per year, depending on acreage. A $670 monthly payment was $8,040 per year. If the new tractor increased productivity 30%, that's $24,036,000 in additional gross income. Minus the $8,040 payment, you're still ahead $16,000, $28,000. On paper, it was a no-brainer. 16 farmers saw that math and signed. They weren't stupid. They were making rational decisions based on the information available. Nobody in February 1980 could have predicted that interest rates would triple and grain prices would halve within 18 months. Walter Brennan saw the same information and said no, not because he was smarter, not because he had better information, because he'd seen booms end before and had developed an almost pathological aversion to debt. Walter had started farming in 1937 at age 18 during the tail end of the Depression. His father had lost a farm in 1932 to debt. Walter had watched that happen, had watched strangers auction off equipment his father had bought on credit. That memory never left him. After the meeting in the parking lot, several farmers tried to convince Walter to reconsider. Jim Wilson, who just committed to a $52,846.40, said, "Walter, you're making a mistake. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Low rates, high prices, modern equipment. You need to leverage this." Walter had known Jim for 30 years. Good farmer, hard worker, 3 kids. "Jim, I hope it works out for you, I really do. But I'm 61 years old. I've been farming 43 years. I'm not taking on 7 years of debt payments at my age. But the 560 is 22 years old. How much longer can it last?" "As long as I maintain it. It's got an engine, transmission, hydraulics, all rebuildable. I can keep that tractor running another 20 years if I need to." Jim shook his head. "You're going to regret this. In 5 years, you'll be farming with ancient equipment while we've got modern machinery and higher profits." "Maybe," Walter said. "We'll see." Another farmer, Bob Mitchell, chimed in. Bob had just committed to a 4440 for $46,500. "Walter, don't you want to grow? Don't you want to expand your operation?" "I farm 400 acres, that's plenty. I'm not looking to get bigger." "But bigger is more profitable. Economics of scale." "Only if prices stay high and costs stay low. If either changes, bigger just means bigger debt to service." Bob laughed. "Prices aren't going to crash. Look at the trends. Ag has fundamentally changed. We're in a new era." "That's what they said in 1928, Walter said quietly. The farmers dispersed, went home excited about their new equipment. Walter went home and told his wife Dorothy what he'd decided. "You didn't trade the 560? "No." "Everyone else did?" "Almost everyone. 16 out of 18. Dorothy had been married to Walter since 1941, knew his history, knew his father's story. "You think they're making a mistake?" "I think they're taking a big risk. Maybe it'll pay off, but I'm not willing to take that risk." Through spring and summer of 1980, Walter watched his neighbors farm with their new equipment. The tractors were impressive, faster, more powerful, more comfortable. Tom Henderson finished planting his 480 acres in 12 days. Walter took 18 days to plant his 400 acres with the old 560. Tom was done a week earlier, but that week cost Tom $670 per month for 84 months. Walter paid nothing. When 1981 arrived and the economy shifted, the differences became stark. Tom Henderson's story is representative. He'd financed $45,200 for his 4440 at 12% over 7 years. His initial payment was $670 per month, but his loan had a variable rate tied to the prime rate. When the prime jumped from 12% to 18%, Tom's rate adjusted to 18%. His payment jumped to $840 per month. Simultaneously, his corn income crashed. In 1980, he'd grossed $87,000 from 480 acres at $3.10 corn. In 1981, at 240 corn, he grossed $67,000. By 1982, at 2.10 corn, he grossed $58,000. His gross income fell 33% while his tractor payment increased 25%. The math no longer worked. Tom tried everything. Cut living expenses to the bone. His wife Betty got a job in town. They stopped heating the whole house, just heated the kitchen and one bedroom, ate beans and rice. But the payment was $840 per month, plus his land payment plus operating costs. He couldn't make it. He missed his first payment in September 1981, called John Deere Credit, explained the situation, asked for forbearance. They said no. Missed 3 payments, and they repo the tractor. Tom scrambled, borrowed from his brother, made the October payment. Missed November and December, made January barely, missed February, March, April. In May 1982, the repo truck came. Took the 440 right out of his field while Tom was planting. He'd owned it for 2 years, paid $21,680 total, and they just took it. The tractor sold at auction for $18,200, less than half what Tom had paid. John Deere Credit applied that to his remaining balance. Tom still owed $20,200 for a tractor he no longer had. And he couldn't farm without a tractor. He bought a worn-out 1950 Farmall M at auction for $800, tried to keep farming, but he was too far behind. Land mortgage, the $20,200 equipment debt, operating loans. The bank foreclosed in March 1983. Tom lost 480 acres his grandfather had homesteaded in 1891. Tom and Betty moved to Cedar Rapids. Tom got a job at the Quaker Oats plant, made $8.50 an hour. Worked there until he died of a heart attack in 1997 at age 62. Betty said the stress of losing the farm killed him. Jim Wilson's story was worse. Jim had bought the biggest tractor, a $50,800, $4640. When rates jumped, his payment went from $780 to $970 per month. His farm was larger, 640 acres, but his debt was proportionally larger too. Jim tried to refinance, tried to consolidate, tried everything. Nothing worked. The bank foreclosed in December 1982. Jim lost everything. He had 3 kids in high school who had to watch their childhood home be auctioned. Jim moved his family to Des Moines, got a job as a warehouse manager. Never farmed again. Died in 2003 at age 68, bitter until the end about how the banks had stolen his farm. Bob Mitchell survived, but barely. He'd bought a $46,500 Ford 440. When things got tight, Bob made a desperate decision. He sold 240 of his 400 acres at fire sale prices just to raise cash to service the equipment debt. Kept farming the remaining 160 acres debt-free, but broken. Bob made it through but was never the same. Farmed until 1998, retired poor, died in 2009 at age 74. Of the 16 who traded in their equipment in February 1980, 13 lost their farms completely between 1982 and 1985. 2 survived by selling most of their land and declaring bankruptcy. 1 survived by inheriting money from a deceased parent that allowed him to pay off the equipment debt. All 16 were devastated financially and emotionally. The equipment they'd bought to grow their operations had destroyed them. Walter Brennan, meanwhile, just kept farming with his 1958 Farmall 560. When corn prices fell to $210, Walter's gross income dropped from $68,000 to $48,000. That hurt. But he had no equipment payment. His only fixed costs were his land payment, and he'd paid his land down to $48,000, remaining on the original $124,000 note from 1955. His payment was $780 per month, at $2. 10 corn, Walter grossed $48,000, had expenses of $22,000, seed, fertilizer, fuel, maintenance, taxes, insurance, netted $26,000. After his land payment of $9,360, he had $16,640 for living expenses, tight but manageable. His neighbors with equipment payments needed to clear $18,000 to $25,000 just to cover debt service before living expenses. At $2, 10 corn, that was impossible. Walter's 1958 560 ran through the crisis. The engine started burning oil in 1984. Walter rebuilt it himself, $380 in parts, one weekend in his shop. The hydraulic pump seized in 1986, rebuilt it, $140 in parts. Clutch wore out in 1988, replaced it, $95 in parts. Total cost, $1,980, $1,990, $4,180 in maintenance over 10 years. Average $418 per year. His neighbors had been paying $8,000 and $10,000 per year in equipment payments. By 1990, Walter had paid off his land completely, owned 400 acres free and clear, was one of only 4 farmers still operating from that original group of 18. Walter farmed debt-free from 1990 to 1995. Those 5 years with no land payment and no equipment payment, he accumulated over $200,000 in savings. When he retired in 1995 at age 76, he sold his 400 acres for $1,450 per acre, total $580,000. Combined with savings, he retired with about $780,000. The 16 farmers who'd taken Rick Sullivan's advice in 1980 and traded their Farmalls for new Deeres, 13 lost everything, 3 survived broken. Combined, they probably recovered maybe $300,000 total from land sales after debt satisfaction. 16 families, $300,000 total. Walter alone had $780,000. Rick Sullivan, the dealer who'd orchestrated that February 1980 meeting, closed his dealership in October 1985, couldn't survive the collapse of equipment sales. He'd made probably $85,000 in commissions from that one meeting in 1980, selling $782,000 in equipment. Felt rich for a few years, then lost everything when the dealership failed. Rick ended up working as a parts clerk at a John Deere distributor in Waterloo, making $12 per hour, until he retired on Social Security, died in 2011 at age 78, never financially recovered. In 2024, Walter Brennan is 105 years old, living in Grandview Care Center in Marshalltown. His mind is still sharp. His body is failing, but his memory is perfect. His grandson Danny farms the original 400 acres, plus another 320 Danny bought with money he inherited from Walter. Danny farms 720 acres total. And occasionally, for special occasions, Danny fires up the 1958 Farmall 560 that Walter refused to trade in 1980. The tractor is 66 years old now, still runs. Danny maintains it the way Walter taught him. It doesn't do much work anymore. Danny has modern equipment for actual farming, but the 560 runs, and that matters. At the 2023 family reunion, Walter's great-grandson, Danny's son, asked Walter about the February 1980 meeting. The boy was 14, interested in family history. "Grandpa, Walter, why didn't you trade the tractor when the dealer said you should?" Walter, 104 years old, sitting in his wheelchair at the care home, thought for a long moment. Then, "Because I'd seen it before, son. Seen dealers tell farmers to borrow and expand. Seen it in the 20s before the Depression. Seen it in the 50s before the squeeze. Every time the pattern is the same. Economy's good. Dealers push debt, farmers borrow. Economy turns, farmers fail." But didn't the dealer believe what he was saying? Oh, absolutely. Rick Sullivan believed every word. Believed he was helping farmers modernize. Believed the boom would last forever. He wasn't lying. He was just wrong. Wrong because he didn't know history, didn't understand that booms always end. So how did you know to say no? I didn't know for sure. Could have been wrong. Maybe the boom would have lasted. But I'd rather be wrong and safe than right and broke. Rather farm with old equipment on land I own than farm with new equipment on land the bank owns. Walter paused, tired from talking, then added, "Of 18 farmers at that meeting, I'm the only one still alive. Only one whose family still farms. That's not because I was smarter, it's because I was more scared, and in farming, scared is often safer than confident. The JD dealers convinced everyone to trade their Farmalls in 1980. 16 of 18 farmers did it. Took the new equipment, took the debt, believed the prosperity would continue. 13 lost their farms entirely. 3 survived broken. Only Walter Brennan, who said no and kept his 1958 Farmall 560, made it through intact. Today, at 105, he's the last survivor. His family still farms. The others are gone. That's the whole story. That's the lesson. Sometimes the person who says no is the only one who survives. The years between 1980 and 1985 were brutal for Walter to watch. Not because he was struggling, he was surviving fine, but because he had to watch his neighbors lose everything one after another while being unable to help. In 1983, Walter attended 7 farm auctions, 7 families he'd known for decades, losing everything. Tom Henderson's auction in March, Jim Wilson's in June, Bob Peterson's in August, each one the same. Equipment selling for pennies on the dollar, families devastated, banks collecting what they could. At Tom Henderson's auction, Walter stood in the back and watched Tom's 4440 sell for $18,200. The tractor was 3 years old, had maybe 2,000 hours on it, looked nearly new. In a normal market, it would have brought $35,000, but this wasn't a normal market. Every farmer in Iowa was selling equipment. Supply was massive, demand was zero. Tom stood off to the side with his wife Betty, watching strangers bid on equipment he'd thought would secure his future. When the 4440 sold, Betty started crying. Tom put his arm around her, said something Walter couldn't hear. They looked destroyed. Walter wanted to go talk to Tom, wanted to say something comforting. But what could he say? I'm sorry you lost your farm because you took the dealer's advice. That wouldn't help. So Walter just stood there, witnessed the destruction, and went home feeling sick. The emotional toll on the community was devastating. These weren't strangers. These were men Walter had known for 30, 40 years. Men he'd worked with on community projects, men whose kids had played with his kids, men who'd helped him when he needed help. And now they were losing everything because a dealer had convinced them to trade their paid-for Farmalls for financed John Deere's in February 1980. 18 months, that's all it took. 18 months from that meeting to the beginning of the foreclosures. Walter's wife Dorothy asked him in 1984, "Do you feel guilty that you survived and they didn't?" Walter thought about that. Guilty? No, I made a different choice. They could have made the same choice, but do I feel bad? Yes. Watching friends lose farms is terrible, even when you know they made mistakes. Do they resent you? Some of them, probably. Tom hasn't spoken to me since his auction. Maybe he blames me for not trying harder to talk him out of it, or maybe he's just embarrassed. I don't know. Tom Henderson never did speak to Walter again, moved to Cedar Rapids, cut ties with everyone from farming. When Tom died in 1997, Walter drove to Cedar Rapids for the funeral. Betty was there, looking old and tired. Walter offered condolences. Betty just nodded, said thank you, moved on to the next person, no conversation. The gulf between those who survived and those who failed was too wide to bridge. Through all of this, Walter's 1958 Farmall 560 just kept running. The tractor became almost symbolic in Marshalltown. Old Walter's 560, people called it. The tractor that should have been traded in, that Rick Sullivan had said was obsolete, that everyone thought was holding Walter back. Instead, it was the tractor that saved him. The 560 was a workhorse. Farmall had built it in 1958 when International Harvester was at its peak of engineering. Simple design, strong components, rebuildable. The inline-six diesel engine was virtually indestructible if maintained properly. The transmission was basic but robust. The hydraulics were simple enough that Walter could rebuild them in his shop. When the engine started burning oil in 1984, showing 16,000 hours on the meter, Walter didn't panic, just ordered a rebuild kit from an IH parts supplier for $380. Spent a weekend pulling the engine, tearing it down, measuring everything, replacing worn parts, reassembling it. The manual said the cylinders should be rebored when they wore beyond Punro 10 oversize. Walter measured them Ruro 8 oversize, still within spec. He honed them with a brush hone, installed new rings and bearings, reassembled everything. The engine ran like new. Total cost $380 in parts plus his labor. A rebuilt engine at a shop would have been $2,500, $3,000, assuming you could find a shop willing to work on a 26-year-old tractor. When the hydraulic pump seized in 1986, Walter pulled it, found the internal gears rusted together from water contamination, soaked it in penetrating oil, worked it free, cleaned everything thoroughly, replaced the seals for 30 files, added a new filter for $12, reinstalled it. Worked perfectly. Total cost $47 in parts. When the clutch wore out in 1988, Walter ordered a new clutch disc for $95, split the tractor in his shop, replaced the disc. One Saturday, total cost $95. Over 10 years, 1980, 1990, Walter spent $4,180 maintaining the 560. That's $418 per year average. In the same 10 years, his neighbors had been paying $8,000, $10,000 per year in equipment payments. But beyond the money, the 560 represented something, the wisdom of keeping what works, of not chasing the newest and shiniest, of understanding that tools are meant to be used and maintained, not constantly upgraded. By 1990, when the crisis was finally ending and the survivors were picking up pieces, Walter's 560 had become legendary. Young farmers would visit his farm just to see the tractor that was 32 years old and still working daily. One young farmer, a kid named Jake Morrison, whose father had lost a farm in the crisis, asked Walter in 1992, "How much longer can that 560 run?" Walter, age 73, said, "Long as I maintain it. Engine's been rebuilt twice. Transmission's original but strong. Hydraulics work fine. Could run another 30 years if someone keeps taking care of it." "Ah, but doesn't it bother you farming with old equipment when everyone else has new? Used to bother me in 1980 when everyone got new tractors, felt left behind. But then they all went broke and I didn't. Now it doesn't bother me at all." Jake thought about that. "So the lesson is to keep old equipment?" "No. The lesson is to not take on debt you can't service. The equipment is secondary. I kept the 560 not because it was better than a new 4440. The 4440 was objectively better. I kept it because it was paid for. That's all that mattered." Jake Morrison took that lesson to heart, started farming in 1995 with rented ground and used equipment, bought his first 160 acres in 2003 with cash he'd saved, never financed equipment. By 2020, Jake owned 640 acres debt-free, all accumulated through conservative growth. He credits Walter's example with teaching him how to farm sustainably. When Walter retired in 1995 at age 76, he had one final conversation with the 560 before handing it over to his grandson Danny. They were in the machine shed, the tractor cleaned and serviced one last time. Walter ran his hand over the hood, the faded IH logo, the worn paint. 37 years, he said. Bought you in 1958 for $3,800. You've plowed probably 50,000 acres, planted 40,000, harvested 35,000. Never let me down when I needed you. Danny, age 28, said, "I'll take care of it, Grandpa. Keep it running." "I know you will. But more than that, I hope you remember what this tractor represents." February 1980, Rick Sullivan tried to convince me to trade you in. 16 other farmers did trade. You know what happened to them? They lost their farms. They lost their farms because they believed debt was a tool for growth instead of a risk that could destroy them. This tractor, this old obsolete Farmall 560, this is what saved us. Not because it was better, but because it was paid for. Walter retired to a small house in Marshalltown, lived comfortably on Social Security and the income from his savings. Dorothy died in 2004 at age 86. Walter outlived her by 20 years and counting. At 105, Walter is the last survivor of that February 1980 meeting, the only one still alive. His family still farms. The others are all gone. Their families scattered, their farms absorbed by larger operations or sold to investors. Sometimes Danny brings his children to visit Walter at the care home. They show him videos on their phones of the 560 still running, still working. Walter smiles, nods, remembers. Last year, in 2023, a farming podcast called Legacy Agriculture interviewed Walter via video call. The interviewer asked, "Mr. Brennan of 18 Farmers at that 1980 meeting, you're the only one who said no to trading your tractor. What made you different?" Walter, 104 at the time, thought for a long moment. Then, "I wasn't smarter, wasn't a better farmer. I'd just seen it before. My father lost a farm to debt in 1932. I watched that happen when I was 13 years old. That memory never left me. So when Rick Sullivan stood there in 1980 telling us to borrow and expand, I heard my father's voice saying, 'Debt will kill you.' Do you think you could have made more money if you'd traded the Farmall? In the short term. Maybe. If the boom had continued, if rates hadn't spiked, if prices hadn't crashed. But that's a lot of ifs. What actually happened was rates tripled, prices halved, and everyone with debt failed. In that reality, keeping the Farmall wasn't just the right choice, it was the only choice that didn't end in foreclosure. What would you say to young farmers today who are being pressured to upgrade equipment on credit? Walter's answer was firm. Ask yourself this: if your income gets cut in half tomorrow, can you still make the payment? If the answer is no, don't take the debt. Equipment comes and goes. Land you own lasts forever. Always choose ownership over appearance. Always choose safety over growth. Always choose boring and solvent over exciting and broke. The interview ended. The podcast aired. Over 100,000 farmers listened to it. Walter's story resonated because it was both tragic and triumphant. Tragic that 16 good farmers lost everything following advice that seemed reasonable. Triumphant that one cautious farmer survived by saying no. The JD dealers convinced everyone to trade their Farmalls in 1980. 16 of 18 did it. Believed the dealers, believed the boom would continue, believed debt was a tool for growth. Within 5 years, 13 had lost their farms entirely. 3 survived broken and poor. Only Walter Brennan, age 105 in 2024, still lives. Only his family still farms. The 1958 Farmall 560 he refused to trade still runs. Everyone who said yes is gone. The one who said no remains. That's not luck. That's wisdom. That's the whole story.